When most people think of Cold War spy planes, they picture high-flying aircraft like the U-2 or the SR-71. But long before those legends were photographing military secrets from the edge of space, the US Navy had its own airborne photographer. It carried no bombs. It carried no missiles. And, in place of guns, it carried cameras. Lots of cameras. This was the Grumman F9F-8P Cougar, a jet born from Cold War panic, transformed into a flying camera platform, and somehow destined to spend part of its retirement as playground equipment for children. And honestly, that's only the beginning of the story. Most stories have another side. This one's just a little stranger. I'm Bill, and this is Buffalo Air Park. Let's dive in. To understand the F9F-8P Cougar, we first have to travel back to the early days of the Cold War. In the late 1950s, American pilots flying over Korea encountered something unexpected. Soviet-designed MiG-15 fighters were outperforming many Western jets. Their swept wings gave them higher speeds, better high-altitude performance, and improved maneuverability. Meanwhile, the US Navy's Grumman F9F Panther still relied on a straight-wing design. Suddenly, Grumman had a problem, and the Navy wanted a solution immediately. Rather than start from scratch, Grumman engineers took the Panther's proven fuselage, tail, and engine and focused on one thing that mattered most: the wings. The result was the swept-wing Cougar. The transformation happened remarkably fast. The first prototype flew only months after development began, and the new aircraft delivered exactly what the Navy wanted. It was faster, smoother at high speed, and capable of approaching the sound barrier in a dive without trying to shake itself apart. But today's story isn't really about the fighter version. It's about the spy. The F9F-8P was the photo reconnaissance variant of the Cougar. Instead of carrying 4 20mm cannons, the aircraft carried cameras, lots of them. Grumman removed the weapons and radar equipment, then stretched the nose about a foot longer to create room for an extensive camera installation. The result gave the aircraft a distinctive profile. Pilots and crews quickly nicknamed it the Duck Bill, and honestly, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Inside that oversized nose was an impressive collection of photographic equipment. Depending on the mission, the aircraft could carry up to 14 cameras. Some were mounted vertically to photograph directly below the aircraft, while others looked outward at angles. One of the most fascinating systems was known as the trimetragron arrangement. Instead of photographing a narrow strip of terrain, 3 cameras worked together, one looking straight down and 2 looking off to the sides. The result was an enormous panoramic view that could capture a massive swath of landscape from horizon to horizon. For military planners during the Cold War, that kind of intelligence was invaluable. The Cougar became less of a fighter and more of a flying map maker. Of course, there was one problem. At 40,000 feet, the air is extremely cold. Cold enough that camera windows could fog up or even freeze over completely. Now, imagine risking an entire reconnaissance mission because your cameras are staring through frosted glass. Grumman's solution was beautifully simple. They routed hot bleed air directly from the engine compressor into the aircraft's nose to keep the camera windows clear. In other words, the jet was literally heating its own face just so it could take better pictures. The Reconnaissance Cougar also carried an in-flight refueling probe, allowing it to stay airborne longer and photograph larger areas. The first probe design was a long, straight tube extending from the nose. The engineers thought it looked fine. The pilots disagreed. Trying to connect with a tanker basket while staring past that arrangement proved far more difficult than expected. Eventually, the probe was redesigned into a shorter, bent shape that improved visibility and made aerial refueling far more practical. But if you think camera systems and refueling probes are strange, wait until you hear what the Navy did next. At that time, engineers estimated that landing gear accounted for roughly a third of the aircraft's weight. Naturally, someone asked a dangerous question: what if we get rid of it entirely? The Navy modified several Cougars with reinforced undersides and developed a rubberized carrier landing surface called the Flex Deck. The concept was simple. Instead of landing on wheels, the aircraft could land directly on its belly. And surprisingly, it worked. Test pilots successfully landed the modified aircraft on the special surface without destroying them. Unfortunately, another problem quickly appeared. Once the airplane was sitting flat on its belly, moving it around a crowded carrier deck became a logistical nightmare. The idea eventually disappeared, joining the long list of aviation concepts that were technically successful but practically useless. Then there's my favorite Cougar story. In the late 1960s, a retired Marine Corps pilot flying a Cougar stopped at a U.S. Air Force base in Japan for fuel. Before departing, he radioed the tower and requested clearance for a flyby at 300 feet and 1,000 knots. For reasons nobody had adequately explained, the tower approved it. The Marine pilot immediately returned for a screaming low-level pass that rattled buildings across the base. When he landed, a collection of very unhappy Air Force officers was waiting. The pilot calmly suggested they review the radio recordings. Sure enough, the clearance had been given. His explanation became aviation legend. He apologized by noting that while he successfully maintained the altitude, he unfortunately hadn't been able to achieve the requested speed. The Cougar wasn't capable of 1,000 knots. And according to him, he spent about 10 seconds debating whether to do it before deciding that being a Marine required certain life choices. Needless to say, he was strongly encouraged not to visit again. Despite stories like that, the Cougar earned an impressive reputation. It became the first swept-wing aircraft flown by the Blue Angels. Reconnaissance versions served around the globe gathering intelligence, and although fighter variants arrived too late for combat in Korea, Cougar trainers later flew dangerous forward air control missions during Vietnam. One surviving example has an especially interesting story. A few months ago, I stood next to F9F-8P Bureau number 144402 at the Maps Air Museum in Canton, Ohio. According to the museum's records, it was accepted by the Navy in June 1957 and spent much of its service life with the Photographic Reconnaissance Squadron 62, deploying aboard both the USS Randolph and the USS Essex before leaving the Navy service in 1962. After passing through several museum collections and private ownership, it eventually arrived at Maps in 2012, where it remains today. And, like many Cougars, it survived long after its military career ended. Some retired examples found homes in museums, others found homes in parks, actual parks. Children climbed on them, played inside them, and treated former Cold War military jets like oversized jungle gyms. One Cougar in California became so worn from years of enthusiastic young visitors that the city coated portions of it with a spray-on concrete just to eliminate sharp edges and keep the playground open, which might be the most unusual retirement plan ever devised for a military aircraft. A jet born from Cold War urgency, a flying camera with a duck-billed nose, a testbed for a wheelless carrier landings, a favorite of our prank-loving Marines, and eventually, a playground attraction. The Grumman F9F-8P Cougar may not be as famous as the aircraft that followed it, but it certainly earned its place among aviation's strangest and most fascinating stories. And that wraps up another tale from aviation's stranger side. Until next time, keep your eyes on the skies.